What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We've got Joe Joyce, 12 wins and 0 losses. By the way, 11 of those 12 wins via knockout, taking on Carlos Takam, 39 wins, 5 losses, and 1 draw. This clash of heavyweights involves Joe Joyce defending some lesser titles, not any of the major 4 titles, but like international silver titles, lesser belts. But, you know, more than any of the lesser belts on the line, this is more so a story of Joe Joyce's surge into the top 10 contenders of the heavyweight division. He just basically cracked the Ring Magazine top 10 contenders after Oleksandr Usyk just retired. So he's been knocking on the door for a couple fights, had his biggest breakthrough fight against top prospect knockout artist Daniel Dubois in November of 2020. So this is basically Joe Joyce's next test before basically taking on a truly elite heavyweight. So in Carlos Takam, he's got a very tested, experienced fighter, wins the vast majority of his fights. Again, 39 wins to only 5 losses and then the draw. But Carlos Takam is now 40 years old. He was really surging in the heavyweight division between 2009, 2010, up to around 2016. And so in that span, he was winning the vast majority of his fights, did fight a draw with Mike Perez. He beat over-the-hill veterans like Tony the Tiger Thompson, who, you know, in the first of their 2 fights, Tony Thompson's versus Vladimir Klitschko, he gave Klitschko problems in their first fight. Klitschko ended up stopping him in both fights. Carlos Takam also beat former title challenger Michael Grant, but again, Michael Grant was well past his prime. Same thing with Francois, the White Buffalo Botha. But Carlos Takam was basically building his reputation, fighting mostly in the country of France. And then he comes to Russia. I said comes to Russia like I'm in Russia. But he goes to Russia to fight 2-time heavyweight title challenger Oleksandr Usyk, as I mentioned, who just retired after that stoppage loss versus Dillian Whyte in their rematch. Oleksandr Usyk lost his first title challenge against Vladimir Klitschko, and then a few years later against Anthony Joshua. Usyk is also a former gold medal winner in the Olympics, and he's a former WBA lesser title holder when he beat Ruslan Chagayev back in 2011. So Carlos Takam fights Oleksandr Usyk in 2014 in Russia. This is for another one of the lesser belts, and Oleksandr Usyk stops him in the 10th round. Knockout win for Usyk. Usyk in his day was a pretty deadly fighter. I mean, he could knock you out in the early rounds, middle or late rounds, stayed pretty low. Again, Olympic pedigree, amateur style fighter who just happens to have a rocket of an overhand right hand. And he's throwing it from a low crouch, lower center of gravity, coming up the top with the right hand. Smoked a lot of fighters that way. So that was a big setback for Carlos Takam, who then won his next 3 fights before fighting Joseph Parker in kind of a IBF title eliminator. So the winner of this fight was going to get to fight for a vacant IBF belt. Well, that fight was very competitive, you know, a lot of back and forth action. Joseph Parker is one of these guys who's been kind of seen as elite or near elite for years now. I mean, he's still pretty young, but he's fought a lot of the best fighters up to this point, including Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte. And one thing about Joseph Parker is that a lot of his fights end up being very close. He's kind of somebody who fights to the level of his opposition. I mean, his last fight with Derek Chisora ended up being a super disputed decision win for Parker. A lot of people thought that Chisora deserved the win there. In Parker's fight just before that against fellow countryman Junior Fa, whom he had fought several times as amateurs, Junior Fa fought Joseph Parker to a super close, I think, decision win for Joseph Parker. That one should have at least been, I thought, a draw maybe. Same thing with that Chisora fight. But Parker comes away with the decision win, and then he goes on to fight Andy Ruiz for the vacant IBF title. Parker wins a very, very, very close and disputed decision there as well. For a long time, he was the only guy to beat Andy Ruiz. And so Parker held on to the IBF title, eventually lost it in a title unification match versus Anthony Joshua in another very competitive and pretty close fight. Kind of bizarre refereeing in that one, and I didn't really agree with the judges' scorecards. But Parker also fought Joshua very close. So after that decision loss to Parker, Carlos Takam goes on, wins his next couple fights, and then he fights Anthony Joshua for, Joshua had 2 of the 4 major belts at that time, because this is just after Joshua beat Joseph Parker, then fights Carlos Takam. And Carlos Takam, in my opinion, should have been the first person to take Anthony Joshua the 12-round distance. They ended up stopping the fight in the 10th round. I didn't think Carlos Takam was necessarily like on the verge of being stopped. Yes, he was getting beaten up, pretty badly. I mean, you're fighting Anthony Joshua and you're losing, but Carlos Takam looked like he was ready to be the first person to take Anthony Joshua the 12-round distance, because up to that point, Joshua had beaten all of his opponents via knockout or stoppage. Or you know what? I had just said that that Joseph Parker versus Andy Ruiz fight was for the vacant IBF belt, but it was actually the WBO belt that was on the line for that fight. So it was the WBO belt that Parker had won in the vacant fight against Andy Ruiz, and then went on to lose to Anthony Joshua. So Anthony Joshua versus Carlos Takam was actually just before Anthony Joshua versus Joseph Parker. So the 2 belts that Joshua had at the time were the IBF belt and then the WBA belt. And again, Anthony Joshua was pretty much winning most of the rounds. Carlos Takam was putting up a spirited effort. Again, I thought that he could have gone the distance. They ended up stopping it in the 10th round. Another loss for Carlos Takam. So at that point, Carlos Takam has lost to Anthony Joshua, Joseph Parker, Alexander Povetkin, and then all the way back in like 2009 versus Gregory Toney. So Carlos Takam is still winning the vast majority of his fights, but anytime he has a truly high step up in class, he seems to be coming up short. So his very next fight was against Derek Chisora. Takam versus Chisora. This is a super action-packed fight. I mean, you could imagine. I mean, Carlos Takam likes to bring it as is. You know how Derek Chisora gets down. All action, sometimes tiring himself out because he's burning gas from the first round onward. But this ends up being a super rugged, back and forth, super entertaining fight. And Derek Chisora ends up scoring a TKO win in the 8th round, stopping Carlos Takam. Big win for Derek Chisora. A very disappointing setback for Carlos Takam, who now is not only losing to the best fighters like Anthony Joshua or Alexander Povetkin, but is now had a big loss against somebody just a tier below that in Derek Chisora. And since then, Carlos Takam has gone on to win his next 4 fights, although against, lesser competition, one of which was former UFC fighter Fabio Maldonado, and then most recently, during the pandemic in July of 2020, Carlos Takam beat Jerry Forrest in one of the first fight cards to take place once the pandemic got going. This was like, no crowd, and can we get anybody who's down to fight in a non-audience setting? Carlos Takam was one of the first to do that versus Jerry Forrest. So he doesn't have any wins against high quality elite or near elite competition, since those back-to-back losses against Anthony Joshua and then Derek Chisora, both by TKO stoppage. So now, 4 wins after that Chisora loss, he's taking on Joe Joyce, undefeated, knocked out all opponents but one. The one guy to take him the distance was former title contender Bryant Jennings, who also took prime or near prime, I would say just past prime, Vladimir Klitschko the distance when Vladimir Klitschko was still dominating the heavyweight division. Joe Joyce was actually a pretty late comer to boxing and actually participated in the 2016 Olympics and won a silver medal. So Joe Joyce actually represented Britain in the Olympics after Anthony Joshua won the gold. So Joe Joyce in his career, he started fighting just gradually more quality opponents in 2018, or at the end of 2018, he beats Joe Hanks. And I remember one of the people I listened to in terms of boxing analysis, Richard Dwyer, actually thought, I believe, that Joe Hanks was going to beat Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce ended up knocking out Hanks in the first round. Please correct me on that, Richard Dwyer or any of his listeners, if he didn't make that prediction. But I believe I remember correctly on that one. After that, Joe Joyce stops a clearly over the hill Bermane Stiverne. This is actually even after Bermane Stiverne got knocked out in that first round against Deontay Wilder, where he just looked atrocious. Bermane Stiverne's first fight after that Deontay Wilder debacle, first round knockout win for Wilder, Stiverne's very next fight was against Joe Joyce. And it took Joe Joyce about 6 rounds, but he got him out of there. Basically hitting him with everything but the kitchen sink and just pummeling him over the course of 6 rounds. Since then, Joe Joyce had beaten Usyk via third round TKO, had that decision win, the only decision up to this point against Bryant Jennings, then has a third round TKO win over a lesser opponent after that, and then he fought Daniel Dubois in a fight that most people probably thought that Daniel Dubois was going to win because of how much of a knockout artist he's been looking like as a professional, and he was significantly younger than Joe Joyce. Since Joe Joyce, is kind of a late starter, yes, he is an Olympian, but, only having turned pro in 2017 and having only 12 fights, right now, Joe Joyce is, I think, 35 years old. Yeah, 35. So it's pretty much, no time to waste. Usually when people are starting their career, they want to have like 20 to 30 fights against lesser competition before they start really taking chances. But when you're 35 years old, being such a late starter and late bloomer in boxing, picking it up super quickly, obviously, and having tremendous success up to this point, but you're on the clock, so you have no time to waste. You got to get down to business. That's where Joe Joyce is right now, undefeated at heavyweight. And in that showdown against Daniel Dubois, kind of a battle of high prospects, kind of a hardcore boxing fans type of fight, Joe Joyce pretty much won the day behind a jab. Joe Joyce, he's kind of a lumbering mover. He's not one of the more agile looking heavyweights in the sport, but he has such an effective jab. He is tall. He's like 6'5.5", so he's right around Anthony Joshua's height. Here, Carlos Takam's about 6 feet even, or just over 6 feet. Just over 6 feet, 6'1", over 6 feet, 6'1.5". And so there's going to be a big height dynamic. 6'1.5". So there's going to be a big height dynamic here between Joe Joyce and Carlos Takam. But against Daniel Dubois, Dubois actually had a slight height advantage against Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce ended up scoring a TKO over Daniel. It was actually ruled a knockout because Daniel Dubois had taken a knee, but he didn't get up for the 10 count. And basically, the jab pummeled his eye. I believe broke an orbital bone or did something vision-wise to where Dubois' career was in question for a minute. But here, I kind of see Joe Joyce versus Carlos Takam being a battle of, does Carlos Takam still think he could be an elite fighter, or has he kind of like resigned himself to saying, okay, I'll be competitive, but I'll lose against the most elite in the division? I think Joe Joyce is going to win this via decision against Carlos Takam. I think Carlos Takam is still savvy enough to go the distance against Joyce, but I do think that Joyce is going to exploit the height gap. He's going to work behind a jab. He's going to be eating up rounds. You know what? I'm actually going to change that. Because he's so effective behind the jab and he's getting more and more confident in letting his power punches go behind that, I don't think that Carlos Takam is going to go the 12-round distance. I do think it's going to be a late TKO stoppage win for Joe Joyce. It might not be knockdown or referee stoppage. It might be in the corner between rounds, but I think that Joe Joyce is going to be well in control by the time we get to the 5th and 6th rounds. And then since there is that height dynamic, Takam I expect to be less explosive, to be able to collapse the pocket while maintaining a defensive construct, to where I think Joe Joyce is going to start being able to land a lot more cleanly, control the distance more easily, and then just kind of put it on him in the middle to late rounds, and I think the stoppage is going to occur. But please, let me know what you think about Joe Joyce versus Carlos Takam. Where do you think Joe Joyce should go if he does get over this Carlos Takam challenge? Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.